Let's talk about the Insidious franchise with my own personal ranking of the 5 films, including The Red Door. Hi guys, I hope you're doing really well. My name is Sarah and welcome to What the Horror, the channel where we talk about horror movies old and new. Today we are talking about all 5 films in the Insidious franchise. I will be including the most recent installment, The Red Door, but if you want my more in-depth thoughts on the film, I will leave a link to my spoiler-free and spoiler review here and in the description box. As well as talking about the films, I will also be giving my own personal ranking. So if you're interested to know my ranking and which of the Insidious movies is my favourite, then stick around until the end of the episode. Also bear in mind that we are talking about all 5 films, and so there will be spoilers included throughout. So, bear that in mind. Insidious is the creation of filmmaking duo Leigh Whannell and James Wan. The first 2 and 5th films star Patrick Wilson, Rose Byrne and Ty Simpkins as Josh, Renee and Dalton Lambert. The family at the centre of the paranormal activity as Dalton Lambert's gift of astral projection lands him in danger when he ventures too far one night and ends up the prisoner of the lipstick-faced demon, the main antagonist of the franchise. The 3rd film stars Dermot Mulroney and Stephanie Scott as father and daughter, Sean and Quinn Brenner, who, while dealing with their grief at the loss of Quinn's mother, are tormented by the man who can't breathe. 3 characters, Elise Rainier, a demonologist, Stephen Specs Fisher and Tucker Croft, 2 paranormal investigators, are the common thread through the franchise appearing in each film. And in the 4th film, we delve further into Elise's past and abilities as she revisits her childhood house where its current inhabitant is being tormented by the key-face demon. In Insidious The Red Door, we revisit the Lambert family 10 years later, trying to deal with the trauma of the events of the first 2 films and finally put the demons of their past to rest. The franchise, which began back in 2010, has so far made over $542 million at the box office on a combined budget of $26.5 million. But this isn't including the Red Door's earnings or budget yet. So while they may not have the highest rating on Rotten Tomatoes for some unknown reason, they're still doing something right as people still love this franchise and keep going to see the movies. Insidious Chapter 1 was released in 2010, written by Leigh Whannell and directed by James Wan. The first Insidious really set the tone for the rest of the franchise. The Insidious films are all a family drama first and foremost. There are no false scares, a lot of jump scares, and the use of colour, specifically red, black and blue, and the use of sound are key elements to all of the films. It's a while before the horror really gets going in the first one as we spend time with and become invested in the Lambert family before the scares and the fantastical elements begin. But when the horror does set in, the first Insidious is an incredibly creepy and, in my opinion, scary movie. Insidious is a love letter of sorts to the classic haunted house films that James Wan and Leigh Whannell love, but it's also an unusual film as it starts as a family drama, moves into haunted house, then becomes a possession film and ends up as an astral projection film. James and Leigh felt there hadn't been many or any horror films that explored the idea of astral projection and thought it would be such an interesting idea to play with. I have heard complaints from people about the Insidious films, how they are a copy-paste-repeat of the other 100 demon films you get, but. While Insidious certainly does contain some of the staples of demon and possession films, what it does so well is alter them enough to make it interesting. For example, with the seance scene, we've seen hundreds of these scenes, but how many have we seen using a World War II gas mask? By adding this detail in, it instantly makes the scene more visually interesting. Insidious also introduces us to the new concept, a new realm in The Further. The Further is a place which is a bit like Limbo. It's a world further than our own, but grounded in our own reality at the same time. I think the visuals of The Further are wonderful, especially as there is a combination of looks. You have the blue hues of the copies of our world, but also the theatrics of the lipstick-faced demon lair. We're also introduced to a variety of entities, and what is quite unusual is that we have both ghosts and demons. We're introduced to the rules and laws around them, so to speak, such as the ghosts are trapped in time and long to live again, that the demon's sole drive is to cause pain and suffering. I have done an entire episode on the franchise's main antagonist, the lipstick-faced demon, and the further, which I will leave a link to here and in the description box. As far as scares go, the first Insidious has some absolutely fantastic ones. I defy anyone to watch this and not be caught off guard by one of them. It contains one of the best jump scares of all time. The image of the lipstick-faced demon behind Josh is pretty iconic by now. But what I enjoy the most about the scares is that James and Lee provide us with a mixture of them. We get the corner of your eye ones where it builds this eerie atmosphere, and then the payoff scares with a jump and a loud noise. I also think that they maintain an almost constant eerie atmosphere that while it builds up, it never really drops back down to zero. So it's constantly keeping you on edge. I know jump scares aren't for everyone, but at least with James and Lee, you never get fake out scares. All of the scares are real and worth the build up. And before The Haunting of Hill House, Insidious was using the whole there's something lurking in the background trick. The you're not quite sure if you saw what you think you saw scare. Insidious is a pretty bleak film. They may end up saving Dalton, but there isn't a happy ending, as Josh's body is possessed by the bride in black, who then murders Elise. There aren't many horror films that can walk that line of being dark without crossing into really disturbing, while also managing to still have a lighter, almost humorous tone. That tone mostly comes from Specs and Tucker, or Spectral Sightings. These two are so obviously based on James and Lee themselves. I don't think Lee had to dig too deep into his writer bag to find inspiration for all the bickering over whether the writing or the visuals are the most important. And I think that that makes them more endearing, and the fact that both Lee and especially Angus Sampson just have perfect comic timing and delivery. Another thing that the first film introduces that will then continue through the franchise is the idea of some of the characters being complex and not necessarily completely likable. They're not all good. They're more realistic with grey areas to them. Take Josh, for example. Not a bad guy, but a distant husband and dismissive of Renee's concerns. I also appreciate that everything in Insidious is practical, with makeup, prosthetics, and stunts. It really helps with the realism of the scares, and I also love how James and Lee root those scares in the everyday, in the safety of the home. Because as an audience, we can then instantly relate to the situation the Lamberts are in. We place ourselves in their shoes, as your home is your safe space, and we've all heard creaks and seen things move in the corner of our eyes. And James and Lee just take those things that we dismiss and then turn them into genuine scares. James has a very distinct eye for horror and creates an instantly recognizable overall aesthetic and look. You know when you're watching a James Wan film. I always love the use of colour. He uses it here, but also in films like Saw and Malignant. But I don't love the low saturation filter of the first film. Chapter 2 was released in 2013, written by Leigh Whannell and with James Wan returning to direct. James and Lee said that they didn't feel the first Insidious necessarily warranted a sequel, but they did a great job of creating a story that fits so naturally with the first. Chapter 2 picks up exactly where the first film left off, so seamlessly, and it really makes for a perfect double feature watch. I mean, it's why they went with the name Chapter 2, because they felt that these films were literally chapters of the Lambert story. My personal favourite part of Chapter 2 is the introduction of the whodunit style mystery, where you end up having two plots running side by side, the family drama, and the Scooby-Doo style investigations by Lorraine, Specs, Tucker and Carl. We get a lot more runtime with Specs and Tucker this time round, always a good thing. And with Josh stuck in the further, his mum Lorraine is a surrogate Josh, while Carl is a surrogate Elise, acting as this film's demonologist / expert. Apparently, when Jason Blum originally watched the first film, his feedback to Lee was that there should be less Specs and Tucker. So they cut some scenes out, but after early screenings showed audiences really responded to the duo, those scenes were then added back in, and that's also probably why they get more screen time in the second film, because they are fan favourites. I enjoy seeing Patrick Wilson this time stretch his acting legs with his playing both the real Josh and then Parker Crane as Josh, and I think his delivery works really well. It isn't much of a stretch to believe that there are the two different versions. And apparently James approached directing Patrick differently as well, depending on which version of Josh he was playing. One thing I don't love about Chapter 2, however, is that poor Renee spends the whole runtime just absolutely frazzled. All she does is cry, scream, run, feel scared. The poor woman never gets a break. And as an extension from that, I think by Chapter 2, I'm done with scares involving the baby. Between the first and second films, there are so many scares where the baby cries and Renee runs upstairs to her. But aside from that, I think the scares are still really effective here. For me personally, I would say that the best scares in the film are when Dalton, in his sleep, tells Lorraine that there is someone stood behind her. It's really simple but incredibly creepy. And the other is when the budget Scooby Gang enter Parker Crane's house and discover his hidden room. Just the image of the rows and rows of victims with those nasty mouldy sheets over them is enough to make you feel like you need a wash afterwards. I like that with Chapter 2 they add more to the lore of the further, so we're not just seeing the same stuff. So despite it being a while into the runtime before we see the further, it feels worth it, as once we're in it we get moments that both feeds back into the opening of Chapter 2 and into the previous film, filling in information that was missing but also expanding on this world. Linking events back into previous films just helps to make this franchise and world feel really solid. Chapter 2 is, along with Chapter 3, one of my favourites visually. Red is always present and important in these films, but they carry it over into Elise's house, which I just adore. She has a friggin' jukebox. While her signature colour is blue, her home is very similar to the demon's lair. It's full of reds, candles, colour glass lamps, unusual knickknacks. I loved it so much that a couple of years ago for Halloween, I actually decorated my house in an Insidious theme based off of Elise's reading room, and I'll insert a picture of one of the areas here. In fact, a lot of the things I use in my set are from that theme, including Spectral Sightings business card. Funny story, I actually, I freaked out a workman who had come round to check the boiler, I think. He did not believe it was for Halloween. I think he thought I was an occultist or something. But hey, what else do we live for if not to freak out our fellow man? There are some wonderful creative choices with the camera as well. When we're following the Scooby Gang, there is a found footage element to it, as we see some of the footage from Specs and Tucker's cameras. But when we're following Specs and Tucker, they also use a handheld camera, which gives it a documentary look, which I'm assuming is a creative choice based on the fact that Specs and Tucker are ghost hunters who document their cases. It feels like you're watching one of those ghost hunting shows. You know the ones I mean. Insidious Chapter 3 was released in 2015 and was written and directed by Leigh Whannell in his directorial debut. I said in my The Red Door review that it's such a wonderful opportunity for Patrick Wilson to have his directorial debut on a movie that he knows so well, with an established audience and with a team of people he knows and works so well collaboratively. And Leigh had the exact same thing with Chapter 3. Leigh admits that the best film schooling he had was sitting to the left of James Wan over the years watching him direct. But Leigh brings his own style, and I personally feel that Chapter 3 feels the most cohesive. As Leigh's writing and directing, there are fewer creative voices and fewer changes to the script. He has this particular shot that he really likes to use, which I just love. It's where he has the character central in shot, framed almost symmetrically. You see it in the theatre when Quinn is auditioning, when Elise is eating breakfast, and my favourite, when Elise is in the restaurant. Also, talking of the audition scene, James Wan cameo. Each Insidious has the haunted house element, but I like that this time the action is moved into an apartment building. So you're then able to utilise all of the space that comes with that, the corridors, the lift, and the multiple apartments. I mean, there is something just so spooky about buildings like that anyway. I don't know if that's just me, but whether it's schools or hospitals or apartment blocks, they're so full of history and have dark hidden areas. Ugh, no. And as well as the location, I just think the aesthetic of the third film is absolutely gorgeous. From the use of light to the colour scheme, and with the building being old, there is a hint of Art Deco in the interiors, as well as, and I'm sure this is intentional, being that it's one of Lee's favourite films, hints of the overlook from The Shining, from the lift to the carpet in the corridors. But as well as the pleasant aesthetic, Chapter 3 has this wonderful sickly feel to it. It feels grimy and nasty, which really complements the story. In Chapter 3, we get a lot of focus on mortality, death, and illness. It's the theme behind this film's antagonist and the driving force for both Elise and Quinn through the film. Chapter 3 really begins to dig more into the character of Elise, and this time we see her dealing with the loss of her husband and the decision to no longer practice her gifts. But there's a parallel between Elise and Quinn, as she's also trying to deal with the loss of her mum to cancer, but also with the strained relationship between her and her father, who relies too heavily on her to run the home and basically raise her brother. Like Chapter 2, Chapter 3 again adds more to the world of the further, which I always appreciate because it keeps it from feeling tired. I mean, Lee has described the further as the right place to pick stories from because it's infinite and contains an infinite number of stories and demons, and they really do utilise that. There's something so nasty and so sinister about the man who can't breathe. This, we learn from Elise, is an entity who doesn't want to live again. It doesn't want to leave the darkness. It instead wants to gather up living souls to join it in the darkness. As far as negatives go with Chapter 3, I would say that the jump scares with the man who can't breathe do feel a little repetitive after a while, and I also think that the ending borders a little on the cheesy pie side, just a smidge. With the mum in a white light and the happy reunion, I mean, it's sweet and it's lovely, there's nothing technically wrong with it, but it stands out in a franchise that is mostly quite dark and bleak in content. Aside from one too many jump scares with the man who can't breathe, the scares in this one are great. In fact, when I first watched these films, this is the one that scared me the most. And one of the jump scares is really gnarly. When Quinn gets hit by a car, it comes out of nowhere and is such a shock. More so, I think, because it's in the realm of realism. Insidious The Last Key was released in 2018, written by Lee Winnell and directed by Adam Robitel. While Chapter 3 began to explore the character of Elise a little bit more, The Last Key really delves into her past and her abilities. Elise began as a smaller side character in the first film, but has basically gone on to become the face of the franchise, and it's not hard to see why. Elise is an unusual franchise hero, but she's strong, she's brave, she's quite funny, and Lin Shaye brings such a level of likability and makes her so endearing. I also think that The Last Door could be Lin Shaye's best performance as Elise. She delivers such an emotional performance as she tries to deal with the trauma of her childhood, losing her mum, her abusive dad, and the guilt of leaving her brother with her dad. We've seen in previous Insidious films humans who are complex and unlikable. We've seen entities who are monstrous, such as Parker Crane and his mother, but The Last Key is the first time one of the films really explores the idea that the living are often the real monsters. You have Elise's abusive father and Ted Garza, who, like Elise's father, abducts women and keeps them in the basement, like you do. Of course, their actions are eventually explained away as demonic, but I appreciate different subject matter for movies in. I also think that The Last Key is the darkest of the franchise. Chapter 3 gives it a run for its money, but the ghosts and the further slightly overshadow just how dark the subject matter in this film is. As far as an entry in the Insidious franchise, I think The Last Key is the one that feels the least like an Insidious movie. The visuals and score are both really different, even the further looks different, and I don't just mean because of the locations, I mean the imagery of it is stripped right back to the simplest details, so it's no longer an exact replica of our world. Again, as this is the fourth film, I do appreciate the little differences that keep the films feeling fresh and not just a repeat. In The Last Key, we have a new setting of the deserts of New Mexico and the prison in the further, which works really well. Perhaps the sandy, warmer setting was inspired by Leigh Whannell living in Spain for a few months to write this film. Either way, despite it feeling the least like a part of the franchise, it still works so well in terms of the movie as an individual. For me, one weakness of The Last Key is that while I actually love the family drama storyline, I think the scares are the weakest, and it has one too many jump scares. Insidious has always used jump scares, but this time it's just a little too much, and I much prefer when they just create a subtler scare. There is a good one in The Last Key where Elise is walking in the darkness of the kitchen or the laundry room, and Specs and Tucker are looking at the footage from her camera, and you just pan past and see these legs standing on a surface that Elise walks past. It's simple, but it works. If you saw my review of The Red Door, then you know that I enjoyed this installment and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars rating on Letterboxd. If you haven't seen my review of The Red Door and would like to know more of my in-depth thoughts on the film, then I will leave a link to that episode here and in the description box. I think they did a great job with this film. Considering it's the 5th film in the franchise, it's visiting a family of characters we've not seen in 10 years, it has a new writer and a new director in his directorial debut, I think they created a strong entry in the franchise and an effective horror film. I was blown away by Patrick Wilson's performance of Josh Lambert. To say he's not played him for nearly a decade, he's slipped back into him seamlessly, but also, and I really love this, delivered a new Josh. This Josh, 9 years later, is not exactly the same one we last saw in Chapter 2. He's older, he's lost his mum, divorced from his wife, and distant from his children. He feels foggy, as he describes it, and is struggling to regain some control over his own mind and memories. It's a wonderful exploration of mental health and how humans grow and change, often shaped by their experiences. I also think that it makes sense to revisit the Lamberts after this amount of time. There is a story to tell that should be told. It's not just making another movie for the sake of it to make some money. I like the choices they went with the Lamberts. The fact that Renee and Josh are divorced feels like the natural stage in their relationship. I like that there are consequences to Josh's actions in Chapter 2, despite it not being him and actually being Parker Crane. And I enjoyed the continuation and evolution of Dalton as an artist and his artwork still having an important role. I wasn't the biggest fan of how they used Elise. However, I do accept the fact that this is a character that they killed off in the first film. And how do you keep finding ways that work to bring them back? We're lucky that they found ways to give us more of Elise in past films in a way that did work, seeing as how they were prequels. So this is, it's a complaint, but a minor one. I did, however, love the surprise cameo from Specs and Tucker. I always appreciate screen time with my faves. I like to consider myself an honorary 4th member of Spectral Sightings. I personally think the scares worked in The Red Door because they followed the blueprint set out by the previous films. You have both the peripheral scares, where you see something in the corner of your eye, which sets the eerie tone, but then builds into a jump scare payoff. Yes, there are a lot of jump scares, but that fits in with the franchise. And it never crosses over into one too many. There was only one scare that I did not like. I said it before, and I'll say it again, and I will continue to say it. We did not need the puking ghost. Since I wrote my review of The Red Door, I have seen other people's, and some people have said that it's weak as a horror film, that it's low on scares and focuses too much on the family drama and on trauma. But My argument to that is that, like I said earlier, the Insidious films have always been family dramas at the centre of it. The horror, the further, and the ghosts have always been additional to that. So The Red Door is again following what has been laid out by the franchise. And Patrick Wilson also made it clear that he wanted to focus on the exploration of trauma and a family's past, making his own film, but also being respectful to the past films. And in my opinion, he nailed it. Okay, so I'm actually going to break my ranking down into 3 different sections / categories, and then I'll give my overall ranking. Just go with it. First, if I was to rank them on how technically good I think they are, then that would be Insidious, Insidious Chapter 3, Insidious The Red Door, Insidious Chapter 2, Insidious The Last Key. Then, ranking them by scare factor, which are the most effective as horror films and have the scariest moments, it would be Insidious Chapter 3, Insidious, Insidious Chapter 2, Insidious The Last Key, Insidious The Red Door. And my ranking for which I tend to rewatch the most, the ones I have more of a personal connection with, and which I judge by how enjoyable I find them to watch, would be Insidious Chapter 3, Insidious Chapter 2, Insidious The Last Key, Insidious, Insidious The Red Door. So, taking all that information, my final and overall ranking of the Insidious franchise is Insidious Chapter 3, Insidious Chapter 2, Insidious, Insidious The Red Door, and Insidious The Last Key. My personal favourite overall is Chapter 3. It's the one I loved the most and the one that scared me the most when I first watched it. I rewatched Chapter 2 the most out of all of them, having already seen it 3 times in the last month, and I'm about to watch it a 4th time, I believe. I think it's hard and unfair to place The Red Door in my personal ranking because I've only seen it once, and so I can't judge it like I do the others, but that will change over time once I have a physical copy. Don't forget that these are only my own personal opinions, so don't be surprised if they differ from yours. And they're probably going to differ because they're all a bit random. I would love to know your ranking of the films because this is a franchise where people always seem to have quite a varied answer. So let me know your thoughts on them and give reasons if you have them. Also, if you've seen The Red Door, do you think that there is a place for further films in the franchise? There has been the rumour of a crossover with Sinister for years now, and let's not forget that in January 2022 it was announced that a new film in the franchise is in development, which is apparently currently titled Thread, An Insidious Tale. It's to be written and directed by Jeremy Slater and to act as a spin-off of the main films, but still set in the same universe. I'm not sure what next week's episode will be, but make sure you're subscribed if you're not already, so you don't miss out on it. But in the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye.